Amazing the contrast between the version of that song, Great Is Thy Faithfulness, with the energy that all of you all sang right before that. For better or for worse, I get my sense of humor from my grandfather. Granddad is one of those people that is not afraid to say anything to anyone. And every time we go out to dinner at a really nice restaurant, he always plays the same joke, and we always look forward to it. We know at the end of the meal that the waiter or waitress is going to bring the bill, and because he's the oldest one, they're going to bring it right to him. And he takes the bill from them and kind of grabs their shoulder and leans in, and he says, "Where do you go to church?" And the waiter starts getting really nervous, looking like his tip is dependent upon his answer to that question. So regardless of whether they actually go to church somewhere or not, they always quickly say, so-and-so Baptist church or this or that Methodist church. And Granddad always replies the same way. He says, "Oh, that's a great church. I tell you what, instead of leaving you a tip, I'm going to send a donation there to the offering plate in your honor." And the waiters never know what to say. They always kind of look confusing, like, is he being serious or not? Am I actually getting a tip or not? And then Granddad tells them that he's joking and that they will actually get their tip, but that it's important to go to church. Now, the other perpetual joke that Granddad uses a little bit more morbidly, every year on his birthday, we gather around him, and he's opening up his birthday presents. And every single year, to this day, whenever he opens my birthday present, he looks at me and he says, "Trey, this better be a good birthday present, because it's probably the last birthday I'm going to have with you." No. I always made sure to get him a really good present, because that leaves a lasting impression on an 8-year-old. I've heard him say that joke now at least 28 times. I know, sadly, that one day that joke will probably have to turn into a reality. But it amazes me how often it is that the church thinks we're already living in that reality. You walk into the average church on a Sunday morning and you can almost hear them say and be groan, "Hey, you can come sit next to me. I mean, this is probably the last Sunday that we're all going to be able to get together anyway." And we bought into this narrative that churches are, for some reason, dying institutions. I've got probably a dozen books up in my office in the church that throw out statistics about how the church is not what it used to be. How church used to be the center of people's lives, but now you're lucky if they come once a month. And we've all bought into this narrative of fear as if it's the new normal. But the church is not dying. Today, of all days, as we celebrate God's Spirit living on Pentecost Sunday, we're mindful of the fact that if the church dies in the year 2013, then it wasn't really alive in the year 2012, or the year 1950, or the year 50 AD. Because here's the thing, if God's Spirit is not powerful enough to live through all the ages, including our own age, then the church was never really alive to begin with. We were never really who we said we were, God's presence on this earth. But something inside of us tonight tells us that there is more to our church than just the people who show up every week. That together we are greater than when we're on our own. Because in this place, in this room, if we allow it, God's Spirit can freely flow among us in a powerful way. You can tell that by the dancing right here on the front row. You can tell that by the laughter at the soup and salad dinners, or by the energetic creativity that the creative teams put the space together every week. You can tell that even by the empty seats that are left vacant by the people who aren't here tonight because they've spent all weekend giving up their time to go to the Morgan Scott Mission Project. The church is not dying as long as Christ lives within us. But today is Pentecost, which celebrates the birthday of the worldwide church. And as we celebrate another birthday, I have to say that I think sometimes we act like we are over the hill. Like the good old days are behind us. That all we have to do is cash out our pension and let the other people do the heavy lifting. That God never changes, so we don't have to change either. But even though we're not dying, I'm not convinced that we're really living either. Because to live fully is to answer the question, what do we stand for? Not what do we say we stand for, but actually what are those things to which God has commanded us to stand up and speak out for justice? But instead we end up at this place where we'd rather our preacher say something nice than to say something. I'm going to tell you a little secret. I got my first gray hair when I was 12 years old. I cannot remember when I got my second one, but I remember when that first gray hair came in, I was so proud. I thought it was so cool because all of a sudden I started to look like my dad. And now somewhere between then and now I have gotten several hundred or perhaps several thousand more, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down either. But that's what happens, isn't it? We get these gray hairs and they keep us perhaps from aging gracefully. And you know what? We get them in the church too. It starts with just one little innocent comment. No, we can't serve communion that way because we've never done it before. And then one day we're going to wake up and realize that somewhere along the way we got old. That's why an old Baptist Sunday school teacher used to say that the 7 last words of the church are, we've never done it that way before. So here's what I'm wondering. Perhaps we need a little midlife crisis of our own. Not where we go out and buy a red Corvette or dye our hair a different color, but where we step back from our lives in the church to examine what's most important and to make room for the Holy Spirit in our lives and in our community. That we learn to change, that we learn to evolve. Because it's not that God's news for the world changes. But we can't afford to be the newspaper that just pretends like the internet wasn't invented. The story of God's good news remains constant. But as the messengers of that news, as the storytellers of that news, our great calling is to reinvent the way that we get our message out into the world so that God's Spirit can get to work. That's why I love it when we sang that song earlier, Great is Thy Faithfulness, when Andrew and Stephen teach us to sing these hymns that are a couple of centuries old, but you wouldn't even know it because they've changed the music to make it something we can relate to something we can dance to and be energized by. Can you imagine the publishers of the Tennessean going door to door and knocking on the door, waiting for an answer, and saying, hey, we've got this great new thing. You can pick it up and read it, and it will tell you what happened yesterday. It's called a newspaper. Do you want to buy one? Well, we don't act like that today. On the flip side, though, anytime a new restaurant in Nashville opens up, you're going to get a handful of people to tell you you've got to go try that restaurant. As if food is something new. That our generation somehow invented the idea of putting food on a plate and eating it. We didn't invent it. But somehow, it still excites us. Well, neither did our generation invent the idea that the one who made us loves us unconditionally. We didn't come up with that idea. But the world has changed. And with it, we become so loaded up with the weight of this changing world on our shoulders. And we've got our share of challenges today that didn't exist a while back. We've got technology and social media. We've got jobs that seem to be 24/7. We've got more and more competing with coming to church on Sunday. But those things can weigh us down. But even so, we've got to reinvent the way that we share God's news so that it brings us to life. And what's great about this is that we don't have to do it on our own. You don't have to do it on your own. We don't have to do it on our own. All we really have to do is to leave just enough room in our hearts and our lives for God's Spirit to flow among us. Just give it a chance and see what happens. To let God's unending love to take flight among us. There's an old story that Fred Craddock used to tell. He says, the other day I saw a 9-pound sparrow in front of my house walking down the street. So I asked the sparrow, "Aren't you a little heavy?" And he said, "Well, yes, that's why I'm walking, to get some of this weight off." And I told the sparrow, "Walk, why don't you fly?" The sparrow looked back at me as if I were crazy and said, "Fly? I can't fly. I've never been able to fly. I've never tried because I'm afraid I might get hurt." I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Church." Will you pray with me? God, we ask your help to take us on a new flight. Help us to get the weight of the world off our shoulders that we may soar above this earth, spreading your good news, spreading your mercy and your compassion with all of your children. God, on this Pentecost Sunday, we remember the birthday of the worldwide church. We remember so many people who have come before us, who have taught us how to live. And God, we ask that you help us to build on that we may not be content, but that we may always seek to take your love and your community to the next level. God, we ask that you bless each one of us and help us to open our hearts to your Spirit.